Imagine a man so powerful, he never needed to pull a trigger himself. Yet his whisper could orchestrate a dozen murders in a single night. A man so invisible to the law, he walked the streets a free man while being the undisputed king of the American underworld. This is not the story of a hot-headed gangster, but of a quiet, calculating genius who built the most formidable criminal empire in American history from the shadows. Stay with me, because the story of Carlo Gambino, the real-life brain of Cosa Nostra, will change everything you thought you knew about power, crime, and the terrifying reality of the Mafia. Before we begin, a crucial disclaimer: this entire narrative is a compilation of facts, historical records, court testimonies, and biographies pieced together from various credible sources. The purpose is not to glorify crime, but to present to you, the viewer, the most accurate and comprehensive account of this enigmatic figure's life and legacy. Our only goal is to ensure that correct information reaches you. Now close your eyes and let your mind travel back to a different time, to the sun-baked villages of Sicily, where our story begins. The island of Sicily at the turn of the 20th century was a place of stark contrasts, of beautiful, rugged landscapes shadowed by poverty and a deep-seated mistrust of authority. It was into this world, in the small town of Palermo, that Carlo Gambino was born on August 24, 1902. His family was not destitute, but they understood the harsh realities of life under a system that often seemed designed to keep them down. From a very young age, Carlo was immersed in the unique culture of his homeland, a culture where family and honor were paramount, but where the concept of omertu, the code of silence, was the unwritten law of the land. He was a quiet, observant child, not given to the boisterous play of his peers. He preferred to watch, to listen, to absorb the conversations of the men in his family as they spoke in hushed tones about the men of honor, the respected figures who commanded not through fear alone, but through a complex web of loyalty, favor, and respect. These men were part of the ancient criminal society known as the Mafia or Cosa Nostra, or Thing. While other boys dreamed of becoming fierce bandits, young Carlo was more fascinated by the men in well-tailored suits who managed the operations, the ones who seemed to wield real power without ever getting their hands dirty. This early environment was his first classroom, and the lessons he learned about the importance of patience, perception, and the subtle exercise of influence would become the bedrock of his entire life's work, shaping the strategist he was destined to become. The Gambino family, like thousands of others, looked across the Atlantic towards America, the land of opportunity. In 1921, a 19-year-old Carlo Gambino slipped into the United States through the port of Norfolk, Virginia, hidden away on a ship carrying Sicilian immigrants. He did not arrive at the iconic Ellis Island, a fact that would later symbolize his entire career. He always preferred the back door, the unseen entry, the path of least resistance and maximum discretion. He made his way to Brooklyn, New York, where a thriving Italian immigrant community was already establishing its own rules, its own economy, and its own power structures. This was the era of prohibition, a constitutional ban on alcohol that, rather than creating a sober nation, had unleashed a golden age for organized crime. The demand for illegal beer, wine, and whiskey was insatiable, and the streets of New York were a battleground for various gangs vying for control of this incredibly lucrative trade. Carlo, however, did not immediately rush to the front lines. He went to work for his cousin, a man who was already making a name for himself in the underworld, the ambitious and ruthless Castellammarese native Vito Genovese. Gambino started at the bottom, but not as a lowly enforcer. His mind was his weapon. He was given tasks that required intellect and cunning. Keeping complex ledgers, managing distribution routes, negotiating with suppliers, and understanding the intricate logistics of a sprawling bootlegging operation. While others were focused on the violence of the trade, Gambino was studying its business anatomy. He saw how money flowed, where the vulnerabilities were, and how to build a resilient organization. He understood that brute force was a tool, but it was a clumsy one. Real power lay in controlling the finances, the networks, and the information. During these formative years in the bootlegging business, he also forged alliances with other young, ambitious Sicilians who would become his partners and rivals for decades to come. Men like Lucky Luciano, a visionary who dreamed of a national crime syndicate, Meyer Lansky, the financial wizard, and Frank Costello, the sophisticated political fixer. Gambino, quieter and more reserved than them, earned their respect not with loud boasts, but with his quiet competence, his reliability, and his unwavering loyalty to the old world codes of Cosa Nostra. He was building his reputation brick by invisible brick, establishing himself as a man who could be trusted, a man who got things done, and a man who never, ever sought the spotlight. This deliberate anonymity, this cultivation of a low profile, was his greatest strategic advantage in a world of egos and flashy gangsters, setting the stage for his eventual, quiet ascent to the very pinnacle of that world. The violent crucible of the Castellammarese War, which raged from 1929 to 1931, was the event that would truly separate the shrewd strategists from the mere thugs and define the future of the American Mafia for generations. On the surface, it was a bloody turf war between two factions, one led by the old guard, boss of bosses, Joe Masseria, and the other by the rising, younger Salvatore Maranzano from Castellamare del Golfo. But beneath the surface, it was a generational and ideological conflict. The old guard, the Mustache Petes, were deeply traditional, insular, and often unwilling to work with non-Sicilians. The Young Turks, led by visionaries like Lucky Luciano, saw a future where business trumped ethnicity, where a national syndicate could bring order and immense profit, ending the constant, costly street wars. Carlo Gambino, still in his late 20s, found himself aligned with his cousin and benefactor, Vito Genovese, on the side of Masseria. But his loyalty was always pragmatic, not blind. He watched, he calculated, and he understood that Masseria's old, fashioned ways were a losing proposition. He saw the brilliance in Luciano's vision and recognized that the future belonged to those who could adapt. The war was brutal, a series of ambushes and assassinations that littered the streets of New York with bodies. Gambino, however, was never the one pulling the trigger. His role was more nuanced, more valuable. He was a logistics man, a coordinator, a trusted lieutenant who ensured that the money, the weapons, and the intelligence flowed to the right people at the right time. He operated in the shadows, his name unknown to the newspapers, his face unrecognized by the police. The war reached its climax with a series of betrayals that would become a hallmark of mafia history. Lucky Luciano, realizing Masseria was a dead end, conspired with Maranzano to eliminate his own boss. In April 1931, Luciano invited Masseria to a lunch at a Coney Island restaurant, and after the meal, 4 gunmen, including Vito Genovese, walked in and shot Masseria to death. With Masseria gone, Maranzano declared himself the new boss of bosses. He called a grand meeting in upstate New York, where he laid out the new structure of organized crime, creating the 5 families of New York and formalizing the roles of boss, underboss, and consigliere. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was peace. But Maranzano, despite his grand titles, was himself a traditionalist at heart, jealous of the modernizing influence of Luciano and his allies. He soon began plotting to kill Luciano, Genovese, and others. However, Luciano's intelligence network, which included the ever-perceptive Meyer Lansky, was superior. They learned of Maranzano's plans and struck first. In a move that symbolized the dawn of a new era, Luciano used a group of Jewish gangsters, provided by Lansky, to assassinate Maranzano in his own office in September 1931. This act sent a clear message: the old ways were dead. The elimination of both old bosses in the same year, an event later romanticized as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, cleared the path for the modern American Mafia. And in this new order, Carlo Gambino, who had navigated the treacherous waters of the war with impeccable timing and quiet loyalty, found his star rising. He was rewarded with a position of significant authority within what would eventually become known as the Mangano family. Under bosses Vincent and Philip Mangano, he was now a caporagine, a captain, leading his own crew of soldiers and earning a share of the family's vast criminal enterprises. He had survived the storm not by being the strongest wave, but by being the deepest, most patient current. And now he was perfectly positioned to flow into the power vacuum that the new era had created. The end of the Castellammarese War and the subsequent rise of Lucky Luciano's commission ushered in a period of relative stability and unprecedented prosperity for the American Mafia. This was the era of the National Crime Syndicate, a board of directors for the underworld where the heads of the most powerful families, including the 5 New York families, Luciano, later Genovese, Profassi, Bonanno, Mangano, and Gagliano, could settle disputes and coordinate national rackets without resorting to all-out war. For Carlo Gambino, now a respected captain in the Mangano family, this was his graduate school in large-scale criminal enterprise. The end of Prohibition in 1933 could have been a catastrophic blow, but men like Luciano and Lansky had already diversified, and Gambino was a keen student of their strategy. He oversaw his crew's deep involvement in the burgeoning fields of labor, racketeering, and loan sharking, which would become the twin engines of his wealth and power for decades to come. Labor racketeering was a masterstroke of criminal infiltration. Gambino's men muscled their way into key unions, particularly the longshoremen's unions on the Brooklyn waterfront, which was under the Mangano family's direct control. By installing corrupt officials, they could extort millions from shipping companies. By threatening crippling strikes, pilfer valuable cargo with impunity, and control every job on the docks, creating a patronage system that bred absolute loyalty. The other pillar, loan sharking, or shelocking, was a brutal but highly effective business. He provided loans at exorbitant interest rates, vigorish, or vig, to gamblers, small business owners, and other criminals who had no access to traditional banks. The enforcement of repayment was swift and violent, but the profit margins were astronomical. $1,000 loan could easily generate $100 a week in interest forever. Gambino, with his mathematical mind, excelled at managing these complex, cash-heavy portfolios. He understood that this wasn't just street-level crime. It was a banking system for the underworld, and he was its quiet, ruthless CEO. During this period, he also solidified his alliance with another rising star, a man who would become his lifelong partner in power, Albert Anastasia, the ferocious and unpredictable head of Murder, Inc., the syndicate's enforcement arm. Anastasia was Gambino's polar opposite, volatile, loud, and notoriously bloodthirsty. But Gambino saw the value in their alliance. He provided the calm, strategic brain, and Anastasia provided the terrifying muscle. Together, they formed a formidable bloc within the Mangano family, their power often rivaling that of the actual boss, Philip Mangano. Gambino continued to cultivate his image as a simple, unassuming family man. He lived not in a mansion, but in a modest row house in Brooklyn. He avoided flashy cars and expensive suits. To his neighbors, he was just a quiet, hard-working businessman. This was a deliberate and brilliant facade. While other mobsters drew attention with their lavish lifestyles, Gambino was building an empire in the shadows, weaving his web of influence through the unions, the shipping industry, and the countless illegitimate businesses that fed his coffers. He was a ghost in the machine of New York City's economy, his name on no corporate ledger, his face in no society paper, but his influence felt in the forced idleness of a dock, in the desperate payment of a debtor, and in the silent understanding that he was a man of immense, unspoken power. This was the core of his philosophy. Real control was not about being feared on the street, but about being the invisible hand that controlled the flow of money and opportunity. He was patiently waiting, consolidating his power, building his fortune, and watching the landscape for the right moment to make his move, knowing that in the world of Cosa Nostra, patience was not just a virtue, it was a weapon. The post-World War II era in America was a time of immense economic boom and social change, a period of suburban expansion and consumerism, and the American Mafia, ever adaptable, evolved to exploit these new opportunities. For Carlo Gambino, now in his 40s and at the height of his powers as a capo, This meant a strategic expansion and consolidation of his criminal portfolio. The old rackets of gambling, loan sharking, and labor corruption continued to pour money into his coffers, but he now set his sights on more sophisticated and far-reaching ventures. One of the most lucrative was the infiltration of the garment industry, a vital economic artery of New York City. Through a combination of targeted violence, strategic corruption of union officials, and the establishment of front businesses, Gambino and his associates gained a stranglehold over the trucking and distribution of garments. A manufacturer who refused to pay for protection would find his deliveries mysteriously delayed, his shipments hijacked, or his showroom vandalized. This systematic extortion, known as the Garment Center Racket, bled millions from the industry and demonstrated Gambino's understanding of how to paralyze a legitimate sector to fuel an illegitimate one simultaneously. He deepened his involvement in the nascent, illegal gambling empire that was being built across the country, particularly with the rise of Las Vegas. While Bugsy Siegel is often credited with envisioning the modern Las Vegas Strip, it was the financial backing and hidden ownership of mob figures like Meyer Lansky, and by extension their partners in New York like Gambino, that provided the capital to build these glittering palaces of chance. Gambino's money, filtered through a labyrinth of shell corporations and intermediaries, found its way into casino projects, ensuring a steady, untraceable flow of profits back to the East Coast. This was a hallmark of his forward-thinking approach, investing in the future of crime. He understood that the cash, heavy nature of casinos was perfect for skimming, the practice of siphoning off profits before they were officially counted and reported to the government, thus evading taxes entirely. This period also saw the strengthening of his crucial alliance with Albert Anastasia, who had become the underboss of the Mangano family. Together, they were an unstoppable force, with Gambino as the architect and Anastasia as the wrecking ball. However, this very power dynamic created immense tension with the family's official boss, Philip Mangano. Mangano, a more traditional and less flashy leader, grew increasingly wary of the Anastasia Gambino bloc. Viewing their growing influence and independence as a direct challenge to his authority, the situation was a ticking time bomb, a classic mafia power struggle waiting for a spark. Gambino, the master strategist, knew that a direct confrontation would be messy and draw unwanted attention. He preferred to let his volatile partner, Anastasia, take the lead and bear the risks. He understood Anastasia's ambitions and his notoriously short fuse, and he skillfully maneuvered in the background, allowing the natural currents of ambition and paranoia to guide events in his favor. He was playing a long, intricate game of chess, and he was perfectly content to let others make the loud, aggressive moves while he positioned himself for the final, quiet checkmate. All he needed was the right moment, the right pretext, and the right alliance to turn the family's internal discontent into his own pathway to the throne. A patient predator waiting for his prey to make a fatal mistake. The simmering tension within the Mangano family finally reached its violent boiling point in 1951, an event that would prove to be the pivotal moment in Carlo Gambino's ascent to ultimate power. The trigger was the increasing arrogance and independence of Albert Anastasia, who, emboldened by his position as underboss and his control over the waterfront, began to openly flout and challenge the authority of the family boss, Philip Mangano. Anastasia saw himself as the true power, the one who commanded the soldiers and controlled the lucrative rackets, while he viewed Mangano as a mere figurehead. The situation became untenable, and according to the unwritten laws of Cosa Nostra, such a direct challenge could only be resolved in one way, through death. In April of 1951, Philip Mangano and his brother Vincent were summoned to a meeting. They were never seen alive again. Their bodies were later discovered in separate locations in Brooklyn, both victims of classic mob-style executions. Philip had been shot multiple times, a clear message of disrespect from his killer. The underworld immediately understood what had happened. Albert Anastasia had made his move, eliminating the boss who stood in his way. With Philip Mangano gone, Anastasia assumed the mantle of boss, and one of his first and most significant acts was to appoint his trusted ally and strategic partner, Carlo Gambino, as his underboss. This was the moment Gambino had been patiently working towards for 3 decades. He was now the second most powerful man in one of New York's 5 families, a family that would soon be known by a new name, the Anastasia family. For Gambino, this was a perfect arrangement. Anastasia, with his terrifying reputation and volatile nature, sat in the spotlight, drawing the attention of law enforcement and the public. He was the fearsome public face of the organization. Gambino, as underboss, remained in the shadows, where he preferred to be, managing the day-to-day operations, the financial flows, and the intricate web of corrupt relationships with politicians, judges, and union leaders. He was the administrative genius behind the throne, the one who ensured the machine continued to run smoothly and profitably. He allowed Anastasia to enjoy the title and the notoriety, while he consolidated real, operational control over the family's vast enterprises. This period under Anastasia's reign was marked by aggressive expansion and immense violence, as the new boss sought to solidify his power and maximize profits. But it was also a period of growing instability. Anastasia's temper and his penchant for violent, impulsive decisions began to worry the other bosses on the commission, particularly Vito Genovese, who had his own ambitions for supreme power. Anastasia's erratic behavior, including the unauthorized murder of a civilian in a barber shop, was seen as bad for business. It drew too much heat. Gambino, ever the pragmatist, watched these developments closely. He understood that Anastasia's leadership style was a liability. The very qualities that had made him a useful ally, his ferocity and unpredictability, were now becoming a threat to the family's long-term stability and, more importantly, to its profits. Gambino began to quietly distance himself, having private conversations with other powerful figures, like his cousin and now rival, Vito Genovese. He saw the winds shifting and knew that to survive and ultimately thrive, he might have to make the ultimate betrayal. sacrificing his longtime partner for the sake of the organization and his own ambition. The stage was being set for another seismic shift in the underworld, and Carlo Gambino, the quiet underboss, was once again positioning himself to be on the winning side, proving that in the Mafia, there are no permanent allies, only permanent interests. The downfall of Albert Anastasia stands as one of the most iconic and brazen assassinations in American criminal history. A stark lesson in the fickle nature of power within the Mafia and the ultimate price of drawing too much attention. By 1957, Anastasia had become a massive liability. His volatile temper, his suspected involvement in the attempted murder of his rival Frank Costello earlier that year, and his general unpredictability had alienated him from the other bosses on the commission, especially Vito Genovese, who harbored a deep-seated desire to become the most powerful man in the underworld. Genovese saw Anastasia as an obstacle to his own ambitions and viewed his reckless behavior as a threat to the entire syndicate. He began quietly building a consensus for Anastasia's removal, and he found a willing and crucial ally in Carlo Gambino. For Gambino, the calculation was cold and clear. His alliance with Anastasia had served him well, propelling him to the position of underboss. But now, Anastasia was a sinking ship, and Gambino had no intention of going down with him. More than that, Anastasia's removal was the final, necessary step in Gambino's own long-term plan. With Anastasia gone, the path to the throne would be clear. The details of the conspiracy were worked out in secret meetings, a classic example of mafia realpolitik. Genovese would provide the sanction of the commission and the muscle for the hit, while Gambino's role was to ensure there would be no internal war within his own family, to smooth the transition, and to betray the man who had been his partner for decades. The execution was carried out with stunning audacity on the morning of October 25, 1957. Albert Anastasia was sitting in a barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, getting a shave, utterly vulnerable and unaware. Two men, their faces obscured by scarves, walked into the barber shop, shoved the barber out of the way, and opened fire on the seated mob boss. Anastasia, a man who had ordered hundreds of murders through his control of Murder, Inc., was killed in a hail of bullets, a violent and ignominious end. The murder sent shockwaves through the city and the underworld. For the public, it was a terrifying glimpse into the brutal world of organized crime. For the Mafia, it was a clear message. No one was untouchable, and the commission's authority was absolute. And for Carlo Gambino, it was the moment he had been waiting for. With Anastasia dead, there was no question about the succession. Carlo Gambino, the quiet, unassuming underboss, the master strategist, was now the boss. He quickly consolidated his power, placing his loyalists in key positions. His brother, Paul Gambino, took over the family's important olive oil and cheese import business, a front for deeper criminal activities. His new underboss was his close and trusted ally, Joseph, Joe the Blonde, Biondo. The family was now officially his, and it would henceforth be known to law enforcement and history as the Gambino crime family. He had achieved the pinnacle of power not through a bloody, public war, but through patience, cunning, and a perfectly timed betrayal. He had used the ambitions and violence of others as stepping stones, always letting them take the risks and bear the consequences, while he remained in the background, quietly moving his pieces across the board until he was crowned the king. His reign, one of the longest and most influential in Mafia history, had now begun, and he would rule not with a clenched fist, but with a calculating mind, steering his criminal empire into an era of unprecedented sophistication and wealth. The Appalachian meeting of November 14, 1957, was a catastrophic event for the American Mafia. A single day that shattered decades of carefully maintained secrecy and plunged the underworld into a crisis of unprecedented scale. A crisis that Carlo Gambino, in his newfound role as boss, would have to navigate with all his cunning. The meeting was orchestrated by Vito Genovese, who, following the elimination of Anastasia, saw himself as the new de facto boss of bosses. He summoned over 100 of the most powerful mafia figures from across the United States, Canada, and Italy to the rural estate of his lieutenant, Joseph Barbara, in Appalachian, New York. The agenda was multifaceted to discuss the post-Anastasia landscape, to address the booming narcotics trade, which some families were engaging in against commission rules, and to formally solidify his own power. Carlo Gambino was in attendance, his presence a testament to his newly cemented status as the head of a major family. However, the gathering was a monumental tactical blunder. A suspicious New York State trooper, Sergeant Edgar Croswell, who had been keeping an eye on Barbara's activities, noticed the influx of expensive cars without of state license plates and set up a roadblock. Panic ensued. Dozens of well-dressed, overweight men in their 50s and 60s scrambled into the woods, stumbling through fields and streams in a futile attempt to escape. Over 60 men were detained and identified, including Gambino, who was caught trying to flee the scene. The public and political fallout was immediate and devastating. For years, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had largely denied the existence of a centralized, national Italian, American crime syndicate. Appalachian provided irrefutable proof. Headlines screamed across the country, Senate hearings were launched, and a massive, coordinated law enforcement offensive began. The myth of the Mafia as a series of disconnected street gangs was dead. For Gambino, this was a professional nightmare. His photograph was now in every newspaper, his name on every federal dossier. His low-profile strategy was in tatters. However, in this crisis, his true genius for leadership emerged. While others panicked, he remained calm. He refused to answer any questions, citing his Fifth Amendment rights, and was eventually released. He returned to New York and immediately went even deeper underground. He understood that the old way of doing business, the large, public gatherings, the flashy displays of wealth, was over. The era of intense government scrutiny had begun, and survival depended on absolute secrecy and a return to the old Sicilian ways of ormert. He became a ghost, communicating only through a trusted few, avoiding telephones, and conducting meetings in moving cars or in the open air of public parks. he also saw a strategic opportunity in the disaster. The Appalachian fiasco severely damaged Vito Genovese's reputation and authority. It was Genovese's meeting, his arrogance, that had brought this heat down upon everyone. Gambino, who had always been wary of Genovese's ambition, now began to quietly align himself with other powerful figures who were also displeased, most notably Thomas Finger Brown Lucchese, the boss of another of the 5 families. Together, they started plotting Genovese's downfall, seeing a chance to remove a powerful rival and, in the process, deflect law enforcement attention onto him. Gambino turned the greatest crisis of his career into a strategic advantage, using the chaos and the collective anger within the commission to isolate and target the man who had once been his accomplice in the murder of Anastasia. He was demonstrating that his leadership was not just about managing crime, but about managing the very environment in which crime operated, adapting to external pressures with a flexibility that would ensure his family's survival and his own primacy for years to come. The plot to bring down Vito Genovese was a masterclass in mafia intrigue, a slow, deliberate, and multi-pronged attack that showcased Carlo Gambino's strategic brilliance and his understanding that the most effective destruction is often achieved without a single shot being fired by one's own hand. The resentment against Genovese following the Appalachian disaster was palpable among the other bosses. He had embarrassed them, exposed their secret society to the world, and brought the full weight of the federal government down upon their operations. Gambino, in alliance with Thomas Lucchese and with the tacit support of Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, who had his own reasons for wanting revenge against Genovese for the earlier assassination attempt, orchestrated a campaign of psychological and financial warfare. The first and most crucial step was to undermine Genovese's most profitable and controversial venture, his massive narcotics trafficking operation. This was a direct violation of the Commission's own rules, which strongly discouraged drug dealing due to the severe prison sentences it attracted, which in turn increased the risk of members turning informant. Gambino and his allies began a covert campaign of informing. They secretly funneled information about Genovese's heroin routes and key dealers to federal narcotics agents, leading to a series of busts that crippled his most important revenue stream and sowed paranoia within his ranks. The second step was an elaborate deception known as the French Connection, fake bust, where Genovese was tricked into investing a fortune in a large heroin shipment that was deliberately compromised by law enforcement, causing him a massive financial loss. The final, most poetic blow was turning Genovese's own protege against him. Joseph Joe Bayon Ziccarelli, a powerful capo in Genovese's family, was persuaded to become a government informant, providing the testimony needed to convict Genovese on specific narcotics charges. In 1959, Vito Genovese was indicted and, based largely on the testimony that Gambino's coalition had helped engineer, was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He would die behind bars a decade later, a broken and powerless man. With Genovese removed, the the power structure of the American Mafia shifted dramatically. Carlo Gambino was now universally recognized as the most powerful and intelligent boss in New York, if not the entire country. He had achieved this not through a violent war that would have drawn more attention, but through subtle manipulation, strategic leaks, and the masterful turning of his enemies' weaknesses against them. He was the undisputed boss of bosses in all but name, a title he wisely avoided due to the target it placed on one's back. His authority was based on respect, fear, and a proven track record of cunning success. The Gambino crime family was now the premier criminal organization in America, and its leader operated with an almost mythical aura of invincibility. He used this position to further entrench his family in legitimate and illegitimate businesses, always emphasizing the need for discretion and a low profile. He encouraged his captains and soldiers to invest in cash-based businesses like restaurants, bars, and vending machine companies, not just as fronts, but as real enterprises that could launder money and provide a credible cover. He continued to wield immense power over the waterfront through the International Longshoremen's Association, and his influence extended deep into the garment industry, the garbage hauling business, and the construction industry. He became a silent partner in countless ventures, his approval, his benediction, necessary for any major criminal or even semi-legitimate enterprise to operate smoothly in New York. He was the puppet master of the city's shadow economy, his influence so pervasive that it was almost a natural force, like gravity, invisible, but dictating the movement of everything within its field. He had perfected a model of criminal leadership that was built on patience, intellect, and an almost preternatural ability to foresee and neutralize threats long before they could ever reach him. The 1960s and early 1970s represented the golden age of Carlo Gambino's reign, a period where his philosophy of quiet, corporate-style criminal management reached its zenith, and his power became truly systemic, woven into the very fabric of New York City's economic and political life. With his main rivals either dead or in prison, Gambino stood at the apex of the underworld, a revered and feared elder statesman whose word was law. His daily routine was a study in deliberate anonymity. He could be seen taking quiet strolls in his Brooklyn neighborhood, a stooped, grandfatherly figure in simple, unassuming clothes, often mistaken for a retired shopkeeper. He lived in the same modest house for decades, shunning the flamboyant mansions and flashy cars that characterized other mob bosses. This was all part of his master plan. By presenting an image of humble normality, he effectively became invisible to the casual observer and, more importantly, to the younger, more aggressive agents of the FBI who were often looking for a more stereotypical gangster. Behind this carefully constructed facade, however, he presided over an empire of staggering scope and complexity. The Gambino family's portfolio was a mirror of the city itself. Their control over the waterfront was absolute. Nothing moved on or off the piers without their knowledge and a piece of the action going back to the family. The garment industry continued to be a cash cow, with manufacturers and designers understanding that protection. Payments were simply a non-negotiable cost of doing business in New York. The family's grip on the private garbage hauling industry was so complete that it constituted a private tax on every business in the city. But Gambino's most brilliant and impactful move during this era was his strategic pivot towards the construction industry, particularly the massive public and private projects that were reshaping the city's skyline. Through a combination of corrupt union officials, like the bosses of the Teamsters and the concrete workers, and the control of key trucking and concrete supply companies, the Gambino family could hold entire multi-million-dollar projects hostage. A developer who refused to pay the required tribute would find his concrete deliveries mysteriously delayed, his workforce striking over fabricated grievances, or his site plagued by costly accidents. This control was famously encapsulated in the term, the Concrete Club, a secret cartel controlled by the Mafia that rigged bids and fixed prices on every major construction project in the city, from the World Trade Center to countless other skyscrapers. The cost was astronomical, adding millions to the price of construction, a hidden tax paid by every citizen. Gambino also maintained a firm ban on narcotics trafficking within his family, a rule he enforced with the death penalty. He saw drugs as a dirty, high-risk business that attracted the worst kind of attention from federal authorities and led to addiction and instability within the ranks. This policy, while not always followed by every soldier, was a key reason for his family's stability and his own ability to avoid prosecution. He was a businessman, and drugs were bad for business. His influence even extended into the highest levels of politics. While he never sought public office, he controlled blocks of votes in key unions and neighborhoods, and he had cultivated relationships with judges, prosecutors, and city officials over decades. A well-placed campaign contribution, a favor called in, or a veiled threat could often sway a decision in his favor. He was the ultimate fixer, the man who could make problems disappear, not through public violence, but through the quiet application of pressure at the right point in the system. He had become more than a gangster. He was a shadow governor, a force of nature whose approval was a necessary prerequisite for any major economic activity in the city, ruling his vast domain with a quiet word and a calm, unwavering gaze that concealed a mind constantly calculating profit, risk, and power, despite his immense power and meticulous caution. Carlo Gambino's empire was not immune to the relentless pressure of the law, and the 1960s brought a series of legal battles that would test his cunning and his legendary luck to their absolute limits. The most significant of these was his indictment in 1969 for masterminding a massive scheme to hijack cargo from Kennedy International Airport, a plot that was a cornerstone of the family's income and exemplified their stranglehold on the city's logistics. The case was built by a determined Brooklyn district attorney and seemed formidable, based on the testimony of insiders and extensive surveillance. For Gambino, this was a direct threat to his freedom and his legacy. A conviction would mean spending the rest of his life in prison. The trial was a media circus, with the aging, frail-looking Gambino presented as the sinister mastermind of a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. He appeared in court not as a fearsome godfather, but as a sickly old man, often wheezing and needing assistance, playing perfectly into the public's perception of his physical vulnerability. His defense team, the best that money could buy, worked tirelessly to dismantle the prosecution's case. But the real work happened in the shadows, the domain where Gambino had always been most effective. Witnesses against him suffered from sudden, inexplicable memory loss on the stand. Key pieces of evidence were called into question under mysterious circumstances. The jury was sequestered, but the pervasive influence of the Gambino name created an atmosphere of unspoken intimidation. In the end, to the shock of law enforcement and the public, Carlo Gambino was acquitted. It was his greatest legal victory, a stunning demonstration of his enduring power and his ability to manipulate the system from within. The acquittal cemented his mythos within the underworld. He was seen as untouchable, a man who could beat the government at its own game. However, another major legal threat emerged from an unexpected quarter. In 1970, the U.S. Congress passed the Organized Crime Control Act, which included a powerful new tool known as the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. This law was a game changer. It allowed prosecutors to target an entire criminal organization as an ongoing enterprise, and to imprison its leaders for the crimes they ordered others to commit, even if they were far removed from the actual acts. For the first time, a boss like Gambino could be held accountable for the collective criminality of his family. The first major test of RICO was not aimed at him directly, but it sent a chill through the entire mafia. Gambino, ever the pragmatist, understood the profound threat this new law represented. It was designed specifically to defeat the kind of insulated command and control structure he had perfected. He advised his captains to be even more cautious, to avoid any written records, and to communicate in even more obscure ways. He began a process of slowly, methodically distancing himself from the day-to-day operations, placing more responsibility on his underboss and consigliere. He knew that while he had beaten the old laws, RICO was a different beast entirely, a legal net that could potentially ensnare him in his twilight years. These legal battles, the acquittal, and the ominous shadow of RICO defined the later years of his reign. They were a reminder that no amount of power could provide absolute immunity, and they forced the aging king to constantly look over his shoulder, adapting his strategies not just to outmaneuver rival gangs, but to survive in a new era where the law was finally beginning to understand and effectively target the very structure of his criminal corporation. As the 1970s progressed and his health began to falter, the question of succession loomed larger than any external threat, becoming the single most pressing issue for Carlo Gambino and the future of his empire. He suffered from a serious heart condition, and his public appearances became increasingly rare, his frame more frail. This physical decline forced him to confront his own mortality and the precarious nature of the dynasty he had built. The choice of a successor was the most critical decision a mafia boss could make, one that would determine whether the family remained a powerful, cohesive unit or fractured into warring factions, vulnerable to both rivals and the law. Within the family, the obvious and most powerful candidate was his underboss, Aniello Nail Delacroce. Delacroce was a charismatic, old-school gangster, a proven earner who commanded the fierce loyalty of the family's toughest crews, particularly those involved in the traditional rackets in Manhattan. He was a figure from the Anastasia era, volatile and flashy, the kind of boss who held court at his social club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy. He represented the past, the brazen, public face of the mafia that Gambino had spent a lifetime avoiding. The other primary candidate was Gambino's own cousin by marriage, Paul Castellano. Big Paul was the polar opposite of Delacroce. He was a businessman, quiet, reserved, and obsessed with legitimacy. He had successfully managed the family's extensive interests in the poultry market and other legitimate fronts. And he shared Gambino's vision of moving the family away from the streets and into the corporate boardrooms. Castellano represented the future that Gambino truly believed in, a future where power was exercised through control of unions and industries, where violence was a last resort, and where the family's wealth was laundered through a web of seemingly respectable enterprises. This created a deep and dangerous rift within the family, a tension between the Zips, or traditional Sicilian faction loyal to Castellano, and the old guard Italian, American faction loyal to Delacroce. Gambino was torn. He respected Delacroce's strength and loyalty, but he feared that his high-profile nature made him a target, and that his leadership would return the family to a more dangerous, attention-drawing era. Gambino's personal affection and familial ties leaned heavily toward Castellano, whom he saw as the man who could best insulate the family's wealth and navigate the new world of RISO prosecutions. In a series of secret, carefully considered meetings, Gambino made his fateful choice. He decided to bypass his own underboss, a move that was a grave breach of tradition and carried the risk of igniting a civil war within the family. He confided in a small, trusted inner circle that he intended to name Paul Castellano as his successor, to appease Delacroce and hopefully prevent a violent uprising. He planned a compromise. Castellano would become the boss, but Delacroce would remain as underboss, retaining control over his own crews and his lucrative criminal operations. It was a precarious balance of power, a delicate political solution that relied on Delacroce's acceptance of being passed over. Gambino, the master strategist, was betting that his own legacy and the sheer force of his will would be enough to keep the peace after he was gone. He was attempting to orchestrate his final and most important move from beyond the grave, trying to secure a future for his family that aligned with his lifelong philosophy of quiet, corporate control. But in doing so, he was unknowingly planting the seeds for a conflict far more destructive than any he had ever managed during his life. A betrayal that would fester in the heart of his organization and ultimately lead to its bloody and spectacular unraveling. The final years of Carlo Gambino's life were a study in the quiet exercise of immense power from a position of increasing physical frailty. A period where he became less an active field commander and more a revered emperor issuing decrees from his secluded throne room. His health continued its irreversible decline, his heart condition confining him largely to his modest home on Ocean Parkway, which became the unofficial White House of the American underworld. A steady, discreet stream of visitors, captains, associates, and even bosses from other families would come to pay their respects, seek advice, and receive instructions. These meetings were brief, conducted in hushed tones, with Gambino often wrapped in a blanket, his voice a soft whisper, but his mind as sharp and calculating as ever. He used this time to finalize his legacy, to cement the alliances and business arrangements that would sustain his family after he was gone. One of his most significant and ultimately controversial acts during this period was his direct intervention in the affairs of the Commission to resolve the Banana War, a bloody internal conflict within the Bonanno crime family that had been raging for years, spilling violence onto the streets and drawing unwanted police scrutiny. The war had started over a leadership struggle and had escalated, threatening the stability and profits of all the families. The Commission, led by Gambino, finally stepped in and decreed that the Bonanno family was to be stripped of its seat on the Commission, a humiliating sanction that effectively made them a second-tier organization. This move demonstrated Gambino's enduring authority. His word was still enough to settle the most violent of disputes and demote an entire mafia dynasty. It was a clear message to everyone that even from his sickbed, he was the ultimate arbiter of power. During this time, he also deepened his family's infiltration into new and highly lucrative areas, particularly the construction industry in New York, which was booming, through a network of corrupt unions and front companies. The Gambino family, under his guidance, effectively controlled the supply of concrete and the trucking for most major skyscrapers being built, including the iconic World Trade Center towers. This was the pinnacle of his corporate style criminal model, invisible, systemic, and incredibly profitable. He also maintained his firm stance against narcotics, a policy that put him at odds with some of his own more ambitious captains who saw the billions to be made in heroin. He understood that the immense profits were a siren song that led to long federal sentences and informants, and he continued to enforce the ban, though the cracks in this policy were beginning to show as younger, greedier members chafed under the restriction. As the months passed, his physical condition worsened. He was in and out of the hospital, his public appearances ceasing entirely. The entire underworld watched and waited, knowing that the passing of this titan was imminent and would inevitably trigger a seismic shift in the balance of power. Gambino himself was acutely aware of the clock ticking down, and he spent his final days ensuring that his vision for the future, his choice of Paul Castellano as his successor, was understood and, he hoped, accepted. He was trying to manage his own succession with the same calm precision he had managed his entire criminal career. But he was attempting to control a force, the raw ambition and violent tendencies of his subordinates, that was perhaps beyond even his masterful manipulation. The quiet of his home, the hushed conversations, the frail man in the armchair, it was all a stark contrast to the storm of ambition, betrayal, and violence that was quietly gathering just beyond his doorstep, a storm that his own decisions had set in motion. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino, the quiet architect of the most powerful criminal empire in America, died not in a hail of bullets on a street corner, not in the sterile confinement of a prison cell, but in his own bed of natural causes, a final, profound testament to the unique and unparalleled life he had led. He was 74 years old. The news of his death sent ripples through every layer of society, from the highest political offices to the darkest, most secretive social clubs in the city. For the public, it was the passing of a legendary bogeyman, a name synonymous with the hidden corruption that plagued their city. For law enforcement, it was the end of an era and the beginning of a great uncertainty. They had never been able to convict him, and now he had escaped their grasp forever. For the underworld, it was nothing less than the fall of a king. His funeral was a spectacle of contrasting images, a perfect metaphor for the man himself. It was held at the Basilica of Our Lady of Grace in Brooklyn, a massive, ornate church that spoke to the stature of the deceased. The streets were lined with thousands of onlookers and reporters, their cameras capturing the procession of long, black limousines. Inside, the church was filled with a who's who of the American Mafia, men with hardened faces and expensive suits paying their last respects to their fallen leader. Yet, amidst this display of power and pageantry, the coffin itself was a simple, unadorned bronze casket, a reflection of Gambino's lifelong preference for modesty and his disdain for ostentatious displays. There were no flashy floral arrangements in the shape of dollar signs, no eulogies that spoke of his criminal exploits. It was a solemn, traditional Catholic service. The most powerful statement, however, was made by the man he had chosen as his successor, Paul Castellano. Now the new boss of the Gambino family did not sit with the immediate family in the front pew. Instead, he remained standing at the back of the church, a silent, imposing figure observing everyone who entered and exited. A clear signal that he was now in charge, that the watchful, calculating eye of the boss was still upon them all, even in mourning. The burial was at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, in a massive, above-ground marble tomb that he would share with his wife, who had predeceased him. The tomb was stark and imposing, a far cry from the modest home he had lived in, perhaps a final, uncharacteristic concession to the immense power he had wielded. As the casket was sealed inside the tomb, it marked the definitive end of a reign that had lasted for nearly 20 years, a period of stability and immense profit for his family. But the peace of that moment was an illusion. The very same day, the complex and volatile machinery of succession began to turn. Driven by the ambitions of men Gambino had believed he could control from beyond the grave. the delicate balance he had tried to engineer, with Castellano as boss and the powerful, passed over Neil Delacroce as underboss, was inherently unstable. The old guard, the street guys, the earners who had built their reputations on violence and traditional rackets, viewed Castellano with suspicion and resentment. They saw him as a privileged, out-of-touch businessman who didn't understand the streets, a boss imposed upon them by nepotism rather than earned through respect and strength. Carlo Gambino was gone, and with him departed the singular force of will, the aura of invincibility, and the deep-seated respect that had held these competing factions in check. The empire he left behind was a masterpiece of criminal enterprise, but it was a masterpiece built on a foundation that was already cracking, its structural integrity entirely dependent on the genius of its architect, who was no longer there to maintain it. The immediate aftermath of Carlo Gambino's death was a period of tense and fragile peace, a calm before the storm enforced by the raw shock of his passing and the sheer force of tradition. Paul Castellano, now officially the boss of the Gambino family, moved quickly to consolidate his power, but he did so in a manner that almost immediately began to alienate the very foundation of the organization. He established his headquarters not in a social club in the old neighborhoods of Brooklyn or Manhattan, but in a sprawling mansion like a state on Staten Island he nicknamed the White House. This physical distance from the streets was both literal and symbolic. He surrounded himself with a new inner circle, men he trusted, many of whom were relatives or associates from his legitimate business ventures, like his consigliere, Tommy Bellotti, a loyal but crude enforcer who lacked the sophistication and political savvy of the old regime. Castellano's focus was laser, like on the pursuit of legitimacy and the expansion of the family's corporate style rackets. He held meetings that felt more like boardroom presentations, discussing profits from the construction industry, the garbage hauling cartels, and his own poultry business. He spoke of minimizing street-level crime and avoiding the dirty work that attracted police attention. To the old school captains and soldiers who had come up under Gambino and Delacroce, men who had earned their bones through violence and ran lucrative gambling, loan sharking, and hijacking operations, Castellano's approach was not just alien, it was an insult. They saw him as arrogant, greedy, and disconnected from the realities of their world. He began demanding a larger share of their illicit profits to fund his grand plans for legitimacy, squeezing the very men whose loyalty he desperately needed. Meanwhile, Aniello Delacroce, the past over-underboss, maintained his power base from his social club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy. He became a symbol of the old ways, a refuge for the captains and soldiers who felt marginalized and disrespected by Castellano. Delacroce, while publicly acknowledging Castellano's authority, as per Gambino's wish, privately seethed. The family was effectively splitting into two rival camps. The White House, faction loyal to Castellano and his vision of a corporate future, and the Mulberry Street, faction loyal to Delacroce and the traditional criminal past. This divide was not just philosophical, It was financial and deeply personal. Castellano's continued and rigid enforcement of the ban on drug dealing became a major point of contention. While Gambino had also forbidden it, he had the personal authority and respect to enforce it. Castellano did not. A new, ambitious, and ruthless generation of mobsters within the family, including a rising capo named John Gotti, saw the billions to be made in heroin and resented being told they couldn't partake. They began dealing behind Castellano's back, funneling immense profits into their own pockets and building powerful, independent organizations within the family, all under the protective wing of Delacroce, who either turned a blind eye or took a cut himself. Castellano, isolated in his Staten Island mansion, was aware of the discontent and the rumors of drug trafficking, and it filled him with paranoia. He began to see conspiracies everywhere and trusted fewer and fewer people. The masterful balance that Carlo Gambino had engineered was crumbling, and the two men he had left in charge were on a collision course. Their mutual distrust and conflicting visions for the family creating a fault line that would soon tear the entire organization apart in a convulsion of betrayal and bloodshed that would have been unthinkable under the firm, respected hand of the old boss. The rise of John Gotti from a violent and ambitious street thug to the man who would ultimately shatter Carlo Gambino's legacy was a direct consequence of the power vacuum and internal rot that set in after the old man's death. Gotti was everything Gambino was not: flashy, loud, hot-tempered, and hungry for the spotlight. He was a product of the streets, a high school dropout who had risen through the ranks as a feared enforcer for the Burgin Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, which was under the protection of Aniello Delacroce. Gotti was charismatic and fiercely loyal to his crew and to Delacroce, but he harbored a deep-seated contempt for Paul Castellano and everything he represented. Castellano's isolation, his demand for a larger share of the street profits, and his perceived weakness were, in Gotti's eyes, a betrayal of the Mafia's core principles. Gotti, meanwhile, was flamboyant. He wore expensive, custom-tailored suits, granted interviews to reporters, and cultivated a public image as a man of the people, a modern-day Robin Hood in his neighborhood. This brazenness was anathema to the Gambino philosophy, but it resonated with a new generation of mobsters who were tired of hiding in the shadows. The critical turning point that set the stage for the final confrontation was the FBI's massive investigation into the Mafia, which culminated in 1985 with the Mafia Commission trial, a landmark row case that targeted the entire leadership of the five families. In a devastating blow to the organization, Paul Castellano, along with the bosses of the other families, was indicted and faced the very real possibility of life in prison for the ambitious factions within the Gambino family. This was a crisis and an opportunity. A boss facing a long prison sentence was a massive liability. He could be pressured to make deals, to flip, and his control over the family's operations would be crippled. Simultaneously, Aniello Delacroce, the one man who had been a buffer between Castellano and the street, was dying of cancer. The two pillars of the post Gambino structure were collapsing at the same time. On December 2, 1985, Delacroce died, and with him died the last vestige of the old balance of power. Castellano, now isolated and desperate, further alienated the family by refusing to attend Delacroce's wake, a grave insult that was seen as the ultimate sign of disrespect. He then compounded the error by threatening to demote Gotti and his crew for their suspected, and indeed very real, involvement in narcotics trafficking. For John Gotti, this was the final straw. He saw a boss who was weak, facing life in prison, and who was disrespecting the memory of his mentor. He believed that if he didn't strike first, Castellano would have him killed. In a move of breathtaking audacity, Gotti and a cabal of other disaffected captains, including Sammy, the Bull, Gravano, decided to orchestrate the unthinkable, the assassination of the sitting boss of the Gambino crime family. They knew that such an act, the murder of a boss without the sanction of the commission, was a death sentence under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. Castellano was isolated, on trial, and had few powerful allies left. Gotti bet that the rest of the family and the other mafia families would accept the fait accompli if it was carried out with brutal efficiency. The plot was set in motion, a conspiracy that would forever mark the end of the era of quiet, corporate control that Carlo Gambino had so meticulously built and usher in a new, chaotic, and ultimately self-destructive chapter for the family that still bore his name. The student of the streets was about to execute the student of the boardroom, and in doing so, would tear down the very walls of the empire. The assassination of Paul Castellano on the evening of December 16, 1985 was not just a murder. It was a violent coup d'état that shattered the very foundations of Carlo Gambino's legacy and signaled the final, definitive end of his era. The location chosen for the hit was itself a symbol of Castellano's isolation and hubris. Sparks Steakhouse, a high-end restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, a world away from the gritty social clubs of the old neighborhood. Castellano was scheduled to have a dinner meeting there to discuss his legal defense with his underboss, Tommy Bellotti. John Gotti and his chief conspirator, Sammy Gravano, had meticulously planned the operation, selecting a team of trusted shooters and positioning lookouts throughout the area. Gotti and Gravano themselves sat in a car across the street, not to participate in the violence, but to witness the event firsthand, to ensure its success and to cement their bond in blood. As Castellano's black Lincoln sedan pulled up to the curb in front of the restaurant, and as he and Bellotti stepped out into the bustling pre-Christmas crowd, they were ambushed. A team of gunmen, dressed in identical trench coats and Russian-style fur hats as a disguise, stepped forward and fired a volley of bullets into both men, killing them instantly on the sidewalk. The brazenness of the hit was stunning. Executed in the heart of Manhattan during the evening rush hour, it was a direct challenge to law enforcement and a clear message to the entire underworld about the new order's ruthlessness and power. The murder sent shockwaves through the mafia. The traditional rules had been utterly violated. A boss had been killed without the formal sanction of the commission. But Gotti's calculation proved correct. With Castellano and his potential successor Bellotti both dead, and with the other families preoccupied with their own legal troubles from the commission case, there was no one willing or able to challenge Gotti's move. He quickly moved to consolidate power, presenting the murder as a necessary act to save the family from a weak leader who was on the verge of sending them all to prison. He leveraged the widespread resentment against Castellano and his own strong base of support among the street crews to claim the throne. Within days, John Gotti was the new boss of the Gambino crime family. His reign represented the absolute inversion of everything Carlo Gambino had stood for. Where Gambino was quiet, Gotti was flamboyant. Where Gambino shunned the press, Gotti courted it, earning the nicknames the Dapper Don and the Teflon Don for his acquittals in high-profile trials and his love of the camera. He became a celebrity gangster, his photo constantly in the newspapers, his movements chronicled by the FBI and the media alike. He abandoned the low-profile strategy that had protected the family for decades, and in doing so, he painted an enormous target on his own back and on the back of the entire organization. The corporate model was discarded in favor of a return to brazen street, level crime, and a public persona that celebrated the gangster lifestyle. Carlo Gambino's intricate, shadowy empire built on patience, silence, and the strategic infiltration of legitimate business was now being led by a man whose guiding principles were ego, audacity, and a reckless hunger for fame, ensuring that the downfall of the house that Gambino built would be as swift and spectacular as its rise had been slow and deliberate. The reign of John Gotti was a spectacular and chaotic interlude that stood in stark, violent contrast to the decades of quiet stability under Carlo Gambino, a period where the family's fortunes, public profile, and internal cohesion underwent a radical and ultimately destructive transformation. Gotti reveled in his new role as the Dapper Don, holding court at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, where he would often hold impromptu press conferences on the sidewalk, dressed in impeccably tailored 2000 suits, mocking law enforcement and basking in his celebrity status. He became a folk hero to some, a symbol of defiance against the system, but to the old-school mafiosi who remembered the Gambino era, he was a walking catastrophe. His very public persona was a gross violation of the core principle of omerta, and brought an unprecedented level of scrutiny from every law enforcement agency in the country. The FBI, which had struggled to pin charges on the low-profile Gambino, now had a target who proudly flaunted his wealth and position. They dedicated immense resources to bringing him down, bugging his clubs, tailing his every move, and turning his own soldiers against him with the powerful leverage of Raicho statutes. Internally, Gotti's rule was marked by paranoia and capricious violence. He demanded absolute loyalty, but trusted almost no one. He surrounded himself with a tight circle of sycophants and feared the ambition of his own captains. Unlike Gambino, who ruled through a council of trusted advisors and respected the chain of command, Gotti's leadership was autocratic and impulsive. He ordered murders for perceived slights, sometimes on a mere suspicion, creating an atmosphere of terror within the ranks. The corporate rackets that Gambino and Castellano had so carefully built began to suffer. The constant surveillance made it difficult to conduct business, and Gotti's focus was often on his public image and legal battles, rather than the meticulous management of the family's portfolio. The construction industry rackets, the garbage hauling monopoly, and the control over the waterfront all faced challenges as law enforcement, armed with new tools and a very public target, began dismantling the systems of corruption from the top down. The family was still earning millions, but it was becoming a leaky ship, with Gotti's legal bills and lavish lifestyle draining resources, and his management style creating internal fissures. The very thing Carlo Gambino had feared most, a leader who drew the heat of the entire establishment onto the family, was now a reality. Gotti's initial acquittals in several high-profile trials only reinforced his belief in his own invincibility, earning him the Teflon Don moniker, but each victory made the federal government more determined. They knew that to break the back of the American Mafia, they had to break John Gotti. The downfall was inevitable. It was only a matter of time. The Gambino family, once a shadowy government within a government, was now a public spectacle, its inner workings exposed for all to see, its fate tied to the flamboyant and reckless ego of its new boss, who was leading it not toward greater power and profit, but toward a very public and humiliating reckoning with the justice system that would have been entirely avoidable had the ghost of Carlo Gambino's philosophy still held any sway. The downfall of John Gotti and the subsequent unraveling of the Gambino crime family's power structure was a direct and inevitable consequence of his repudiation of Carlo Gambino's core principles, a dramatic demonstration of how ego and publicity can destroy what patience and silence built. The end began not with a bang, but with the quiet, methodical work of the FBI, who, frustrated by their inability to convict Gotti in previous trials, launched an all-out assault on his organization. Their key breakthrough came from placing a listening device not in the Ravenite social club's main room, but in an apartment upstairs that Gotti and his captains used for their most sensitive conversations. It was there that the FBI captured hours of devastating evidence, with Gotti himself heard orchestrating crimes, discussing murders, and mocking the law. But the most critical blow came from within. Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's underboss, and the man who had been a key architect in the Castellano murder, began to feel the heat of Gotti's paranoia and the weight of the impending Rica case. Gravano, a ruthless killer in his own right, realized that Gotti was preparing to pin the bulk of the family's crimes on him to save himself. Facing the rest of his life in prison, Gravano made the calculation that would have been unthinkable in Gambino's day. He decided to flip. In 1991, he agreed to become a government witness, providing testimony that was as comprehensive as it was devastating. He detailed dozens of murders, including the hits on Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti, and laid bare the entire inner workings of the Gambino family under Gotti. Gravano's betrayal was the ultimate violation of omerta, and it was the final, decisive weapon the government needed. At the trial in 1992, the combination of Gravano's testimony and the damning audio tapes from the Ravenite apartment was overwhelming. The Teflon Don was finally convicted on April 2, 1992, on all counts, including murder and racketeering. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and was sent to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, the most secure federal prison in the country, where he would live out his days in solitary confinement, dying of cancer in 2002. His conviction was a landmark victory for law enforcement and a catastrophic defeat for the Gambino family. But the damage did not stop with Gotti. Gravano's testimony led to the conviction of hundreds of mobsters across the country, decimating the ranks of not only the Gambinos, but all 5 families. The family was thrown into chaos, leaderless and terrified, with everyone suspecting everyone else of being an informant. The corporate rackets that had been the source of its immense wealth were exposed and dismantled by federal prosecutors. The systematic control over the construction industry, the garbage hauling businesses, and the waterfront was broken. The Gambino family, once an empire, was reduced to a scattered collection of competing factions, a shadow of its former self. The public spectacle of Gotti's trial and the sordid details revealed by Gravano had stripped the mafia of its mythic aura, revealing it not as a noble society of men of honor, but as a vicious, greedy, and ultimately self-cannibalizing criminal enterprise. The house that Carlo Gambino built, a structure designed to withstand external pressure through silence and infiltration, had been brought down not by a rival gang or a new law, but by the internal rot that festered when its foundational philosophy was abandoned for the fleeting glamour of the spotlight. The legacy of Carlo Gambino is a complex and enduring tapestry woven with threads of immense power, ruthless strategy, and a paradoxical code of honor that continues to fascinate and horrify decades after his death. To understand his impact is to look beyond the immediate chaos that followed his passing and to examine the very blueprint of modern organized crime that he helped design and perfect. His most profound contribution was his demonstration that the highest level of criminal power could be achieved not through the barrel of a gun, but through the quiet application of intellect, patience, and strategic foresight. He was the architect of the corporate mafioso, a model that has been emulated by criminal organizations around the world. His philosophy was simple yet revolutionary: minimize violence not out of compassion, but because violence is bad for business. Avoid the spotlight because visibility attracts enemies, both rival and federal, and infiltrate legitimate industries and labor unions because that is where real, sustainable power and profit reside. He understood that controlling a union could yield more money and influence with less risk than 100 armed robberies. He saw that a partnership with a corrupt politician was more valuable than a dozen contract killings. This vision allowed his family to operate with a degree of impunity that seems almost mythical today, deeply embedded in the economic and political machinery of America's largest city. His personal life was a monument to his philosophy. He rejected the gaudy trappings of wealth and power, living a life of calculated modesty that served as the perfect camouflage. He was a devoted family man, a grandfather, a neighbor, and simultaneously the CEO of a vast criminal conglomerate. This duality is central to his mythos. He proved that the most dangerous predator is often the one you never see coming. His ability to evade significant prison time, dying an old man in his own bed, stands in stark contrast to the fates of his successors, nearly all of whom died violently or spent their final years in prison cells. His name itself became a brand, synonymous with organized crime in America. The Gambino family forever etched in the public consciousness as the archetype of the mafia. Yet, his legacy is also one of ultimate failure, a cautionary tale about the impermanence of even the most brilliantly constructed criminal empires. The very structure he built, reliant on a powerful, singular intelligence at the top, could not survive without him. His own choice of successor, Paul Castellano, while intellectually aligned with his vision, lacked the personal authority and street credibility to maintain control. And his bypassing of Neil Delacroix planted the seed of the rebellion that would eventually topple his dynasty. The rise of John Gotti was a direct repudiation of everything Gambino stood for, and the family's very public implosion under Gotti's flashy and reckless leadership demonstrated the fragility of a system built on a cult of personality. In the end, the FBI's Rights-O statute, a legal tool developed precisely to combat the kind of insulated corporate structure Gambino had perfected, proved to be the undoing of his creation. The law finally caught up with the model, and without a leader of Gambino's caliber to adapt, the empire crumbled. His story is a dark chapter in the American narrative, a proof that the pursuit of power through crime, no matter how intelligent or disciplined, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Doomed to collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions, the relentless pressure of the law, and the inevitable, corrupting nature of absolute power. And so, the story of Carlo Gambino, the silent, calculating brain of Cosa Nostra, draws to a close, not with a dramatic finale, but with the quiet, lingering echo of a lesson about the nature of power itself, from the sun-drenched, impoverished villages of Sicily to the teeming, opportunity, rich streets of early 20th century New York. His life was a relentless, single-minded pursuit of control, orchestrated from the shadows with a patience that bordered on the supernatural. He was not a product of his environment so much as he was its master, using the chaos of prohibition, the violence of the Castellammarese War, and the ambitions of volatile men like Anastasia and Genovese as mere stepping stones on his path to supremacy. His reign demonstrated that true authority does not need to announce itself. It simply is an unseen force that dictates the flow of money, the fate of industries, and the lives of countless individuals, both within and outside his lawless domain. He built an empire not of territory, but of influence, weaving his organization into the legal and economic fabric of a great city, until the two became almost indistinguishable, a parasitic and powerful symbiosis that allowed his family to thrive for decades. His legacy is a double-edged sword, a testament to the potent combination of intellect and ruthlessness, and a stark warning about its inherent limitations. He proved that crime could be corporatized, that a low profile was the ultimate defense, and that patience was the deadliest weapon in a mobster's arsenal. Yet, in the end, the very human flaws of ego, ambition, and mortality that he so skillfully managed in others ultimately unraveled the tapestry he had woven. His carefully chosen successor could not command the loyalty he did. The new generation, embodied by John Gotti, rejected his wisdom for the hollow glamour of celebrity, leading the family into a spectacular and humiliating downfall. The legal system, once outmaneuvered by his guile, eventually developed the tools to dismantle his creation piece by piece. The story of the Gambino crime family is, in its final analysis, the story of Carlo Gambino's rise and the long, slow fall that began the moment he breathed his last. It is a saga that forces us to look beyond the romanticized Hollywood images of the mafia and confront the more terrifying, banal reality of systemic corruption, of a power so deep and so quiet that it becomes a part of the atmosphere, felt but unseen until it is too late. It is a reminder that the most dangerous men in history are often not the conquerors on horseback, but the accountants in back rooms, the quiet uncles offering advice, the men who understand that the pen, the ledger, and the whispered word can be far more powerful than the sword. The world has moved on. The mafia's power has waned, but the chillingly effective strategies of Carlo Gambino continue to be studied, not just by historians and criminologists, but by modern criminal enterprises around the globe. His life remains the ultimate blueprint for building a criminal empire, and his downfall serves as the eternal warning of its inevitable fate. This has been the story of Carlo Gambino, a narrative pieced together from countless sources to bring you the most accurate account possible. If you found this deep dive into the hidden history of organized crime compelling, if it kept you engaged and made you think, then please show your support. Like this video. Share it with others who are fascinated by the real stories behind the legends, and subscribe to the channel for more meticulously researched content like this. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these complex, factual stories to light, and most importantly, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the shadows of history. Thank you for listening.